Hey everybody, thank you for checking in once again and welcome to another one. In these days of high prices for pretty much anything photo related, certainly vintage lenses, you could be forgiven for thinking that the days of finding cheap bargains are over. However, forgiven or not, you'd be wrong, because the bargains are still out there. I'm going to share with you today some of the best bargains I've found over the past 2 or 3 years or so, and I'm going to share the approach I used to find them. So if you want to find some bargains in vintage lenses or film cameras or indeed mirrorless cameras, keep watching. Alright, so my approach to finding bargains can essentially be summed up in 2 words, and they both begin with P. One is patience and the other is persistence, and you need to have plenty of both if you're to find the bargains either on eBay or charity shops or wherever else you source your photo gear from. You might be lucky, you might be just lucky and walk into a charity shop and there's something waiting for you, or you open eBay and boom, there's something exactly right waiting for you at the right price. That can happen, but more likely it's going to take time. So you're going to need to be patient and you're going to need to be persistent. In other words, you're going to need to search regularly. So you've got to check eBay every day. You've got to keep looking. You've got to keep searching for what you want. It's entirely possible that if you look often enough for what you want, you'll find something that you weren't looking for that is nevertheless a real bargain. And those things happen. Those serendipitous bargains do come, I find, if you look at eBay enough or go into your charity shops enough or, wherever else it is you source your lenses from. But you're unlikely to do it without those 2 things. You're unlikely to find the bargains without being really patient and really persistent. I must have spent, hundreds, maybe even thousands of hours scouring eBay, both for stuff I want and just generally looking around, what's around, what photo gear's around, which cameras are selling, which are going cheaply, which are not. So you've got to do that. I spent hundreds, maybe thousands of hours doing it, and it has paid off. I'll tell you some of the bargains that I've found. I've got quite a few of them, actually. A Helios 44, my lovely, beautiful silver, or rather aluminium-bodied Helios 44, 13 blade, the absolute top of the tree for Helios lenses. And usually it sells for around £100 to £150. I've even seen them go for more than that. Well, now, this one I found, it was sitting unloved on eBay for weeks and nobody wanted it. And I think the reason nobody wanted it was because in the advert, the seller happened to mention that there were 1 or 2 tiny bubbles that he'd seen in the glass, tiny little air bubbles. And he thought it was a flaw, and he wrote very honestly that they were there. He also said it doesn't affect the picture in any way. Well, now, I've been involved with the former Soviet lenses since the late 70s, and I happen to have an instruction manual for a Fed 4L camera that I got for Christmas when I was 14, and in that instruction manual it says that it is common to have 1 or 2 little tiny bubbles in the glass, but don't worry about it, it's entirely expected and it won't spoil your pictures. So that was part of the former Soviet lenses. They very often did have bubbles in the glass, so it wasn't a flaw as such. So I bought this lens for £30. In fact, I couldn't see these bubbles, and it's a very beautiful lens, and I've used it ever since. That was maybe 3 years ago I bought that lens. At the time they were going for £100 to £150. I don't think they've changed very much that was a bargain that I've found. If you're looking for an f2 50mm lens, there are lots and lots of those around. Every manufacturer made one. But I've found the best way is not to buy them individually as lenses, but to buy them on cameras. That can often be much cheaper. So just as an example, I recently, probably a year ago, bought an Olympus OM30 film SLR with a Miranda 24mm f2.8 lens on it. Now, it's hardly been used. It's practically brand new in condition. And there are a lot of these cameras about. There are a lot of Olympus OM30s about. People don't seem to go for them too much. Those are going pretty cheaply now, so you can get one of those with a lens for 30 to 40 pounds. The Minolta Consumer SLR, I forget what it was exactly. I'll put it up on screen. I forget the model number, but I'll put it on screen. I bought one of those with a a Minolta 50mm f2 on it. That's a beautiful lens. Lovely little camera. I paid £30 for it. That was, what, a year, 18 months ago. So it's often a good idea to look for cameras with lenses on them. That's one way to do it. And consumer level SLRs, rather than the pro grade ones, the consumer level SLRs, like the OM30, those are particularly cheap at the moment. So that's a good source to start. If you're looking to start in film, that's a good place to go. You can use that lens on your film camera. You can also use it on your mirrorless camera. I bought my OM30, a Miranda 24mm. I think it was about £35. It certainly wasn't more than £40. I consider that a real bargain. Now, one thing you sometimes do have to do when you're playing this game is you do sometimes have to take a little risk. So very often the lenses that are not selling and the gear that just doesn't sell is not very well photographed and not very well described. It might have 1 or 2 lines of text describing it. So in those cases, you take a risk if you buy them because the description isn't clear, and the fear is, my fear anyway, always is, gosh, it's not very well described because there's something wrong with it, and this is a way for the seller not to describe what's wrong with it. So that's always my suspicion, that's always my fear. But you do have to go out on a limb, on that kind of limb sometimes, and buy the stuff that's not very well described and not very well photographed, because that's the stuff that nobody wants. People go for the nicely written ads, the nicely photographed ads. Those are the ads that make the top prices. The ones that are not very well photographed, not very well described, they don't. They tend to sink, and very often they don't sell at all. Unless I buy them, that is. So that method has netted me some real bargains. Now, one of them was a Canon T70, beautiful little camera, lovely little automated camera from the latter end of SLR production. It's not got the classic SLR look, but that doesn't trouble me personally. It's a great little film camera, and it came with a 50mm f1.4 lens on it, the Canon FD 50mm 1.4, one of the nicest, possibly the nicest of the later FD lenses, certainly one of the nicest I've shot. That camera was very badly described and photographed, and I could only just, from the photographs, I could only just make out the lettering on the lens, 50mm f1.4, but it was very, very unclear, very, very indistinct, and it did take me a little while to work out what lens was actually on the front of that camera. But I bid on it, nobody had bid on it, I bid on it, I paid £26 for it. Admittedly, that was, what, 2.5, 3 years ago. However, those cameras and lenses were going for quite a bit more than that at that time. So that was a direct result of taking a little risk and buying a camera that wasn't well described and wasn't well photographed. My CZJ Pancolar, Carl Zeiss Jena Pancolar lens, one of my favourite lenses. again, I took a bit of a risk on it. It wasn't well described. It wasn't well photographed. It was clearly underexposed, slightly blurry images. The kind of images that might lead you to think someone was trying to be a little bit deceptive, but I had no reason to think that as such, and eBay's great because you can always send the stuff back if it's not in working order. So I bought this lens. I paid £80 for it. That was quite cheap. The Pancolas at that time, this is going back probably about 3-4 years, Pancolas at that time were going for £100 to £150, similar to what they're going for now. I bought this one cheap at £80. When I got it, it was mouldy, it was full of fungus. So I thought to myself, gosh, you know, taking a risk, yeah, it pays off some of the time, but it doesn't pay off all of the time. However, I then thought again, I thought, I wonder if I could clean it. So I had a look at online at how this lens came apart, and actually the front and rear elements are very, very easy to remove on these lenses. CZJ lenses are renowned for being rather complex in their construction, but not this one with the front and rear elements. Very easy to get off, just one little screw ring, threaded ring, and they both come off. Well, now I was lucky. The mould and the fungus was behind only the first elements, both front and rear, and I was able to clean them in vinegar and just, you know, restore the lens to proper working order. However, because it wasn't as described, I mentioned this to the seller. I mentioned it was mouldy and full of fungus, and we agreed that I could have the lens for £40. So I got a CZJ Pancola, which after I cleaned it was in top-notch order for £40. Now that was a real bargain. It was a bit of a risk, but this is another thing. If you're handy with a lens spanner, you can clean a little bit of fungus from most vintage lenses, assuming it's just behind the first front element or the first rear element. Usually you can get those out with minimal difficulty, clean them up and put them back, and you've got a nice working lens again. So it does pay to be able to do a little bit of DIY on these lenses. I'm not a lens technician by any means. I am not trained in lens engineering and optical engineering and taking lenses to bits, but I'm prepared to do a little bit, and I never go with any work on lenses or cameras any further than I know I can. If I don't know that I can do the next step that needs doing, I don't do it, because that's too much of a risk. That might be like when I took one of my dad's watches apart when I was 3 years old and sadly couldn't get it back together. Who would have thought it? My Fed 10 lens, 1936 uncoated Fed 10 lens, was another such. It was full of mould and fungus. I bought the lens for £10. Mould and fungus were not mentioned. I didn't trouble the seller about the mould and fungus when I got it, because I'd only paid a tenner for it and I didn't expect great things. But I knew that these lenses were very easy to dismantle and to service, and I also knew that being an uncoated lens, it was more likely to have stood the rigours of time because there were no coatings to be damaged. So I just took the lens apart, very, very simple to do, cleaned it up, put it back together, all nice and working. What's another one? The Olympus Mewtwo that I bought recently, maybe 6 months ago. I bought that in a charity shop, and the charity shop just didn't know what the camera was worth. So I bought it, and I paid £5 for it, and that was really quite something. That was quite one of my better bargains, I think. I have found in the past, I have found a couple of other Mewtwo cameras in charity shops, but I think this one was my best bargain because they're now worth a little more than they used to be. So check out your charity shops. Don't stop going into them. It doesn't mean that because, you know, prices have increased, it doesn't mean you won't find a bargain. So keep on checking out those charity shops. Another bargain I found this time, a really cool mirrorless camera with a modern lens on the front. That was a Sony A7R Mark I, the 40 megapixel version, with on the front a very, very beautiful Carl Zeiss 35mm f2.8 modern autofocus lens. And I paid £400 for the camera and the lens, and that was a real good price. That was, I think, 3 years ago, round about 3 years ago. That was about half price I paid. They were going for twice that. Both the camera and the lens were going for twice that. So really that combination was worth around £800, technically speaking, if you look at what those cameras were going for at that time. I bid on it. This was a bid. It wasn't a buy it now, it was a bid. So there were other people wanted it, but nobody wanted to pay more than I did, which was just slightly over £400, which I couldn't really understand that. But there we are. It just shows you the bargains are out there, and that was a massive bargain. So by sometimes taking a risk, by being patient, by being persistent, and by listening to my intuition as well. Sometimes I just get an intuition about an ad and I think, yeah, that's a good one. I've got a feeling that's a good one. I'll get that one. Doesn't always pay off, but it does much of the time, maybe even most of the time. So persistence, patience, take a little risk now and again, and listen to your intuition. Those are all the approaches, those are the methods and approaches I've used for finding vintage lenses, and it's yielded some really good results. Now, if you can't find the lens you want or the gear you want in the time that you have, and you're getting a little bit tired of waiting, think of something else. Try a different approach. There are lots and lots and lots of cheap lenses available. I've covered hundreds of them in the videos on this channel, so you can check out the back catalogue and have a look at that. But I can tell you right now, if you can't find the lens that you want, there are loads of cheap 50mm lenses about. For example, the Prakticar 50mm f1.8, that's really cheap. There's the 8-blade Helios 40 if you want a bit of swirly Biotar type fun. If you want a 50 f2 or a 51.8, almost all manufacturers made those. Olympus made a really nice one. Minolta made a very, very nice one indeed. Canon made one, the FD one. Got to admit, I'm not too keen on that one. It's a nice lens, but my one was a bit flat, so I wasn't too keen on it. There is a Nikon version, the Nikon 50 f2. I featured that on the channel maybe a month or so ago in a video of its own. That's a beautiful lens, but Nikon gear is a little bit more expensive than most other camera manufacturers' equipment because it gets collected and because it's got the Nikon name on the front. The Nikon 50 f2 is a beautiful lens, but so is the Olympus 51.8, so is the Pentax 55 1.8 or f2. And I think that of the lenses from the major manufacturers, the major Western manufacturers, I think the Pentax 55 f2 is possibly the nicest. Certainly it will give the Nikon a run for its money. One word of warning though, if you're looking for a mirrorless camera that's not too expensive and you're looking maybe at some used Sony APS-C cameras or maybe at some Micro Four Thirds mirrorless cameras, there's plenty of those about at good prices, you might see in amongst those ads adverts for mirrorless camera, brand new, £150. Don't buy them. Technically it's true, they don't have a mirror, so technically they're a mirrorless camera, but in fact all they are is a very, very tiny sort of phone sized chip in a body that looks like a mirrorless camera. The lens won't come off. It doesn't have removable lenses. It's just a piece of junk. So be very, very, very careful. If you're buying second-hand gear, don't be tempted to buy one of those brand new ones. I think they're priced around about £150 at the moment. Don't buy a brand new cheap mirrorless camera, because they are not what you want. When we talk about mirrorless cameras, we're talking about cameras from major manufacturers, Sony, Canon, Nikon, Fujifilm, with a good sized sensor, at least a micro four thirds sensor. Mirrorless cameras have big sensors, and even a micro four thirds camera is pretty enormous compared to what's in those little cheap, allegedly mirrorless cameras. Just a word of warning, just a word to the wise. So there we are. That's my method for finding bargains, and those are some of the bargains I've found using it. I can't guide you to particular bargains, that's for you to do, but what I can say is if you are patient and persistent, you will find the bargains. They are out there. So I guess that's about it from me for today. I hope you've enjoyed the episode, and I hope you found it interesting and informative. If you've enjoyed it, please do chuck us a sub. That would be very much appreciated. Many, many thanks to subscribers for your support. That is really appreciated. Many, many thanks go to patrons for your support. That is enormously appreciated also. Thank you to anybody who's given thanks, super thanks, tuned in, or engaged with the channel in any way. Thank you to everybody for doing that. As for me, that's it for now, but if you're not doing anything too rational, logical, or mathematical around this time next week, please do tune in for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.